Hello and welcome to today's video, the importance of the Yalta Conference, which will also be going into a following secondary conference, the Potsdam Conference. Now, the Yalta Conference is one of these things that I would deem a turning point of history. If you are familiar with the TV show on Disney Plus, perhaps, Marvel's What If, this is definitely a place that in a different universe could have ended a completely different way. So with all of that said, let's jump straight in. So some background knowledge. Now, the Yalta Conference is sometimes seen by historians as the origins or beginnings or the preamble to the Cold War. Now, the Cold War began as World War II ended or concluded. Now, it was a political rivalry between the East and West, specifically the East of Europe, West of Europe, or Western aligned countries, Eastern aligned countries. Principally, the major players, of course, were America or the United States of America and the Soviet Union or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. As people study and discuss the Cold War, they inevitably end up referring to the USSR as Russia or Russia as the USSR when they do the Russian Revolution, whatever the case may be. So if I catch myself doing that, I'll try and correct it. It should be the Soviet Union or the USSR. Russia was simply a part of the Soviet Union in the same way that England is a part of the United Kingdom or California is a part of the United States, just to get that out of the way. Okay. Now, essentially, the Cold War was because Americans and the Soviets were terrified of each other. By which I mean they both were convinced that their way of doing things, their political ideology, their political system was the right way of doing things. And they should expand that political system to other countries, teach them how to do it their way, if you will. And they were suspicious that the other country was trying to do the same thing. So if America, for example, is trying to export Western democracies, the USSR is trying to export Soviet socialist republics, if you will, by which the entire world is going to become one or the other. This is actually where we end up with the phrase, if you've heard it before, the third world, with the first and second being the West and the East, and the third world being the countries that were sort of up for grabs, if you will. Just as a little fun bit of trivia there. So when it comes to our background knowledge, we need to understand these two ideas, capitalism and communism. Now, I could actually talk or do an entire video on just this slide. I'm not going to do that. We're going to try and break it down as succinctly as possible. Now, essentially with capitalism is the idea of basically free markets, free economy. And the market and the economy fixes everything for you. So everything sort of will naturally find this equilibrium. So if I make the best shoes, for example, customers will like my shoes so much that I will become successful, and the market has decided that my shoes are the best shoes, okay? Whereas in communism, and I almost become wealthy selling all my shoes. In communism, the idea is, no, it doesn't actually work that way, because even though I may make the best shoes, if another company has better advertising or better marketing, gets a better celebrity to endorse their product, whatever it is, people invariably buy those shoes. And even though I'm technically the more skilled craftsman or whatever the case may be, I'm not guaranteed to make money. So communism essentially is the idea that what we'll do is we'll have the state own everything. And then we will find the best shoemaker and we'll have the state-made shoe brand or whatever the case may be. And this way, the state will control everything. There won't be these people manipulating markets and trying to sell products that aren't maybe the best products, trying to exploit their workers, all this kind of thing. The state will control everything to make sure everything's fair. So this means that from those two standpoints, people should be free to make as much money as they can, would be the capitalist way. Whereas if people are free to make as much money as they can, they'll try and use that money for nefarious means to protect their own interests, all those sorts of things. And that money could go to better use helping people. They should have to share their wealth. So to that end, factories should be owned by private companies and individuals in capitalism, whereas the state will own the factories and companies and things of this nature to make sure they stay pure and uncorrupted by greed and things like that. So this goes down the line. Obviously, in capitalism, the government should interfere as little as possible, whereas in a communist system, the government has to be involved in all aspects of life to make sure that all aspects of life are fair. In the capitalist system, the press is allowed to criticize the government. In Soviet communism, the press was not allowed to criticize the government because the government is doing what's best for the people. So theoretically anyway, so if the press is saying bad things about the government, it means people won't trust their government, and the government's work to make people's lives better becomes a lot harder. So we're going to get rid of that. And there should be no government interference with religion in capitalism, whereas in Soviet communism, there is no religion. It's all just the government. It's all the state. It's just the country. It's just the people. Okay. Now, again, that's a really, really brief summary. Like I said, we could go even further than that. But essentially, it comes down to the idea that the government in Soviet communism is run by the people for the people to the most extreme extent. So we're not going to allow any companies to make bad products or take advantage of people. The only people that can do anything is the government to make it as fair as possible. The flaw in that system, of course, being, what if the government wasn't very good there? Then there's nothing, the people in that country can't go anywhere else because that's the only option they have. Whereas in capitalism, you go, oh, well, so that person's making shoes and they're terrible, but I've got the option of going and buying other shoes. Yeah. But then because people have all these options, the government can say, well, it's not our job to help you. You've got all these options, go figure it out. And you end up with this inequality. So there's pros and cons to both systems. I'm not here to say that Soviet communism is evil or American capitalism is evil. I'm not here to say Soviet communism is perfect or American capitalism is perfect. There are pros and cons to both systems. But the key for our understanding is the American capitalism, or the Western democracies, if you will, believe their system was the best. And the Soviet communism, the Soviets believed their system was the best. They wanted to expand and export them beyond their own nations. Okay? So with all of that said, that should hopefully give us a brief introduction to the world we're talking about. So in the context of World War II, we've got these leaders. I hope you're aware of them. If not, I'll just give a quick rundown. We've got Winston Churchill, who is the head of the British Empire at the time, as the Prime Minister of England. He's the most powerful person in that British Empire. We've also got Joseph Stalin, who is the head of the USSR, the Union of Soviet Social Republics. And we have President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is obviously in charge of the United States of America. Now, Churchill is starting to give some warnings during World War II. He is saying, hey, we're all allies here, because the Soviet Union was allied with the United States and allied with Britain to defeat Nazi Germany. And Churchill was saying, hey, the Soviets are kicking the Germans out of those Eastern European countries, which is good for us, but they seem to be setting up their own communist governments there. They're getting rid of the Nazis, good, but they're exporting communism. That's not great. So Churchill sort of could see that this struggle was coming. Okay, so the West, France, Britain, USA, they start to feel that Stalin is trying to strengthen his position in Europe by taking over as much of Germany and Eastern Europe as possible. Whereas the USSR is claiming that Stalin is just trying to protect from any more invasions and create this sort of buffer zone between Germany and the USSR. Because, of course, Germany had invaded the USSR in Operation Barbarossa in 1941, but that's a whole nother video. Okay? So Stalin is trying to stop any future attacks by making sure that this little buffer zone exists between the Soviet Union and Germany. And that's sort of a cause for tension. So they decide to have a conference. Okay, they're going to sit down and talk about it, say, hang on, after we defeat Nazi Germany, what should we do? So it's best for everyone. So it's completely and utterly fair. So we end up with these big three, okay? This is a term that's used, the big three of the Yalta Conference. So we've got Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Britain. He wants free and fair elections and democratic governments in Eastern Europe. No communist governments there, please. Then we've got Joseph Stalin, leader of the USSR. He wants Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. Basically, his idea is we're going to set up these communist governments there, and us, the USSR, as the most powerful and influential communist government in the world, we'll have to teach those governments how to run. And so we'll have to be involved a little bit there. That's basically his justification. And then we have Franklin Delano Roosevelt, before his successor, Harry S. Truman, takes over in 1945. Now, his biggest aim at this conference is not necessarily to worry about what's going on in Europe. He wants Soviet support in the war against Japan. He's sort of thinking in the short term. He's thinking, hey, we're not just fighting Nazis. I'm also fighting the Imperial Japanese Empire in World War II in the Pacific. So I have more to think about than just Europe. That's basically where the big three are at this time. So where is Yalta? Well, as this amazing arrow demonstrates, Yalta is here in the Black Sea. So we're talking in the south of the USSR at the time. It is currently in modern day Ukraine. This is sort of an area that's a little bit controversial in the world today. They have had wars over this area before because it's such a strategic location. But this is where Yalta is. So they decide to have a conference, and they're essentially on Stalin's home turf here. Okay, so whoops, follow that web link. So this is the big three at the Yalta Conference. We've got Winston Churchill on the left, we've got Franklin Roosevelt in the middle, and we've got Stalin on the right. Now, in actual fact, the Yalta Conference is somewhat known for these gentlemen getting along quite well, believe it or not. There was a lot of mutual respect amongst the big three. Now, it was relatively clear at this time that Germany is essentially finished. This is in February of 1945 that they decide to hold this meeting. So their D-Day landings have taken place in France in June, starting June 6, 1944. So we've got Britain and France and the USA moving across Europe from the west towards Germany, and we've got the Red Army of the USSR that's moving from the east towards Germany. It is quite clear that World War II is going to come to an end. So they decide that they need to figure out what to do before this comes to an end. Let's try and address this problem before it gets any worse. So in February 1945, this is before the end of World War II. That is really, really important. This is before Germany is officially defeated, and this is before Japan is officially defeated. So Germany wouldn't be officially defeated until May of 1945, and Japan would not surrender until August of 1945. So this is taking place amidst World War II and while the war is underway. So this was what was agreed upon by Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt. They decided that Germany was going to be divided into 4 zones. One zone controlled by Britain, one zone controlled by France, one zone controlled by the USA, and the last zone to be controlled by the USSR. So this is to stop Germany from being able to be a continuing threat after the war. So they're going to stay in Germany and occupy it, which they did not do at the end of World War I. And this is the idea here being to ensure that Germany cannot rise to become a threat to Europe again. So they can all agree that Germany is the current threat, and we're going to stop them from being a threat in the future. So this is somewhat going well. They also decided that Berlin, which was the capital of Germany, even though this city is going to be in the Soviet-controlled zone, as the most important city in Germany, the saying being, he who controls Berlin controls Germany, controls the nation of Germany, they also were going to split that city into 4 separate parts. This becomes a really big deal during the Cold War to come. Nazi war criminals were to be hunted down and tried. So all of the big 3, Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt, all agreed that there would be trials after World War II for the leaders of Nazi Germany who have committed these terrible atrocities during the war. So they all agreed on that. And free elections were to be held in the states of Eastern Europe once they'd been freed from German control. Now, this may seem a little bit boring or wonky or whatever it is, but this was really, really, really important, because at the time, Stalin's original plan was just, no, we'll just install a communist government there and it'll be so good and so effective that the people won't want to change it. So there'll be no need for elections. At least that's the way Stalin was trying to sell it from his perspective. In a more cynical view of it, it was simply Stalin installing people who he knew he could control and essentially taking control of those nations. But let's give him the benefit of the doubt. He's trying to sell it his particular way. And Stalin agreed to enter the war against Japan in return for Soviet gains in the Far East. Now, this is huge, okay? The USSR is without question wiping the floor with Nazi Germany. They have absolutely destroyed the Germans in the east of Europe. They have pushed them far back. World War II in Europe is won by the Allies together, but without question, the Soviets have taken the most amount of ground from the Germans, and they've contributed the most amount of both physical and natural resources to the war effort as well. So getting the Soviet war machine to also turn its attention to Japan would be huge. It would bring a swift end to that war. And that was what one of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's, FDR, one of his aims was. And Stalin has agreed to that. But he's going to need to take some land when the war is over against Japan. That's one of his caveats, if you will. And they have decided that after the war, there's going to be this new organization created, a new body called the United Nations. Now, depending on your level of knowledge here, there was a predecessor to the United Nations called the League of Nations, which was designed to keep the peace after World War I, and it obviously failed miserably due to the fact that we got World War II. So this was meant to be to replace the League of Nations and to make it much more effective. And kind of a big deal is America and the Soviet Union are agreeing to join this particular body. One of the criticisms of the League of Nations was that the Soviet Union and the United States were not members. America never, and the Soviet Union only for a period of approximately 6 years before they left. So this is a big deal as well. And of course, Germany is going to have to pay some reparations for the war. Now, this is actually one of the criticisms at the end of World War I, that reparations imposed upon Germany sort of made them angry and crippled and desperate that they turned to Hitler, who then started World War II. Maybe that's a topic for another video, but the idea is Germany is going to pay back the costs of the war to the Allies. And they're going to be able to force them to do that because they're going to occupy it in those 4 zones. So this is pretty good. All of these particular ideas are agreed upon by Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt. So Churchill's sort of getting what he wants. He wanted the free and fair elections in the East. Stalin said yes. Roosevelt wants the USSR to enter the war against Japan. Stalin said yes. But Stalin also wants the promise of a little bit of control in Eastern Europe, which he's sort of getting, and also some land from Japan, which he's getting, and he wants to be paid back by Germany, which he's getting. So at the moment, this looks pretty good. Everyone's sort of winning at this time. However, things take a turn for the worse. At this point, this is where I should say where Marvel's what if would end here with, this is brilliant. Churchill, Stalin, Roosevelt, they get along so well, and everything's going fantastic, and there is no Cold War ever, and there was peace on Earth for years to come. But there's a problem. If I just go back one moment to the big three. If you look here at our central figure, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he is looking a little bit weaker than you may have seen him before if you studied the Great Depression in the 1930s, when he first became president in 1932. He's been president of the United States for 13 years, and his health is not as strong as it once was. So this conference takes place in February, and Stalin has great respect for Roosevelt because Roosevelt has been in charge for 13 years. Roosevelt is a very strong figure. He has great respect for Winston Churchill because Winston Churchill is a wartime leader. He is the one who insisted upon the Germany first policy as opposed to addressing the war with Japan first when the USA entered the war. He is the person who gave his stirring speeches about inspiring Britain to fight on alone against the Nazi jackboots. And he has been inspiring to his people, and Stalin respects that. So Stalin respects Churchill, he respects Roosevelt, he gives a little bit to them, they respect him, they give a little to him, everything's going well. But between February and this next conference, Potsdam, that takes place in May, unfortunately, Franklin Delano Roosevelt dies in office, and he is replaced by Harry S. Truman. So the second conference they have, which is after the surrender of Germany, but before the surrender of Japan, we have a second big three. So Harry Truman has replaced FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Clement Attlee has replaced Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill is voted out of office once World War II ends. The people of Britain respected him as a war leader, but did not think that his what were known as hawkish policies, his aggressive policies, would translate well to the post-war era, to the supposed era of peace. So Clement Attlee is elected to become Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he replaces Churchill. And Harry Truman has replaced Roosevelt. Now, this is a problem because Joseph Stalin had great respect for Churchill and great respect for Roosevelt, and did not extend that respect to Clement Attlee and Harry Truman. As a matter of fact, he believed both leaders to be somewhat weak, and he referred to them as accountants or bean counters. He thought they were just essentially glorified accountants, glorified administrators, as opposed to actual leaders to be feared and respected. So this conference takes place in July. So this is again before Japan has surrendered, but after Germany has surrendered, has some different outcomes. So even though it's only been 4 months, technically speaking, since their last conference, so much has changed. So Roosevelt is gone, and Truman does not trust Stalin and does not want to negotiate with Stalin. He doesn't like him because he's a communist. Churchill is defeated in an election. Soviet troops have taken over much of Eastern Europe and have stayed there. And there have been none of these promised free elections. So at the Yalta Conference, these areas of Eastern Europe were supposed to be allowed to have free elections where they could choose to become communist nations if they wanted to, or to become Western allies, Western democracies. These elections have not happened, and they are still occupied by soldiers and troops from the USSR. And the 16th of July, the USA had successfully tested the first atom bomb, and they did not share this secret with Stalin. Remember, Stalin is and the USSR are supposedly key allies of the USA in World War II. They are supposed to be key allies in the war against Japan. But the USA, which has developed this brand new superweapon, does not tell the USSR about it. And the division of Germany into 4 and treatment of war criminals was confirmed at Potsdam. So at least the agreement that took place at Yalta about splitting Germany and occupying Germany to prevent it becoming a future threat, that remains. But almost every other part of the agreement does not. And now there is a lot of distrust that is brewing amongst them. So instead of from the Yalta Conference, where it seemed like the USSR and the USA and Great Britain were going to be able to work together going forward, and once the war ended, there would be this time of great peace and free elections and democracy or communism being spread peacefully around the world. Instead, now it looks like there's a new confrontation brewing. And it was clear after Potsdam that the alliance between the USSR and the West was over. Their mutual enemy of Germany is defeated and gone. And Japan is going to surrender in August. This is July. So the war against Japan is also coming to an end. So it's not seen by Truman that he needs to work with Stalin. And it's definitely not seen by Stalin that he needs to work with Clement Attlee or Harry S. Truman. So this is where we end up with the Cold War. Now, if Roosevelt had not died in April, perhaps he turns up at Potsdam with his forceful personality and Stalin relents and grants the free and fair elections. And maybe if Winston Churchill's re-elected, maybe, what if? We will never know. But essentially, the Yalta Conference was meant to be setting up the peaceful future of the world. And unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way. So these are our big three. Clement Attlee on the left, he's been Prime Minister for 20 days. We have Harry S. Truman, who has been president for 3 months and was unelected, technically, by which we mean he was the vice president. People vote for the president, and the president picks the vice president. So he picked Harry S. Truman, but he has not been voted into office by the people. And then we have Stalin, who has been in power for 21 years. So he is looking at these other two people with him and seeing them as rookies, if you will. So we can see we've got these elder statesmen that all respect one another at the Yalta Conference. Not everyone got what they wanted at the Yalta Conference, but no one got nothing either. It was a very cooperative agreement. Whereas at Potsdam, basically the only thing they could agree on was carving up Germany. Everything else was thrown out the window. So in this particular example, we can see that we had these experienced statesmen, experienced politicians at Yalta, whereas Stalin had the upper hand at the Potsdam Conference. So Germany is indeed divided. We can see we end up with East Germany and West Germany, with the southern part of West Germany to be occupied by the Americans, the northern part of West Germany to be occupied by the British, and the most western part of Germany that borders with France is to be occupied by France. The same arrangement for the nation was also set up in the city of Berlin, located here within East Germany, within the area controlled by the USSR. And so essentially we end up with this, the Cold War, and hence the term East versus West. You can see that the nations that end up in NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, against the Soviets, are essentially the countries of Western Europe, with obvious exceptions of Greece and Turkey. And the countries that end up aligned or as part of the Warsaw Pact, as part of the communist bloc, as it would become known, are in the East. So we end up with East versus West. And this becomes a point of tension. We can see we've got countries such as Austria, Yugoslavia, and even Greece early on, Sweden, Finland, that are neither aligned to the West, as it were, nor aligned to the East. So these became almost the front line. This is where the Western powers wanted to extend their power into, and this is where the Eastern Bloc wants to extend their power into. So, who is to blame for the failure of the Potsdam Conference? Who should we say was at fault? We could say that it was all the USSR's fault. Let's just blame Stalin. It's completely and utterly him. It's his fault. It was cold and harsh in its dealing at the conferences. Refused to set up free and fair elections in Eastern Europe, and it wants to spread communism beyond its borders. That's it. They're the bad guys. We've got it settled. Is one way you could look at it. You could also say it was America's fault. How would you make that argument? Well, it failed to understand the suffering of the USSR in the Second World War. As we talked about, the most amount of troop losses, the most amount of civilian losses, the most amount of resources lost. The Nazis engaged in a scorched earth policy. Essentially, they destroyed the areas they were retreating from. The USSR has been absolutely scarred by its participation in the Second World War. So they are wanting to make it worth it. So they are really, really wanting to get something out of these agreements. And the USA was essentially only interested in what they could get. We want your help against Japan, and that's all we want. We're not interested in hearing anything else. Okay? And the USA failed to understand the USSR's position of wanting to create this buffer zone in Eastern Europe. Now, had there been some support negotiation here, maybe Eastern Europe wouldn't have necessarily fallen directly under the control of the Soviet bloc. Perhaps it could have been more like those neutral countries, perhaps, had the USA, particularly Harry S. Truman, been more willing to negotiate at Potsdam. Then again, there's a third option. Maybe it's everyone's fault. So there was a lack of mutual trust. USA did not trust the Soviets did not trust the USA. And because of this, there's an overreaction from both sides. So from Potsdam, both sides take a more aggressive stance towards each other. So essentially, when we were at Yalta and things are looking like everyone's going to be able to work together, albeit, we're not going to get everything we want, but we can cooperate going forward and make things a little bit better. After the Potsdam Conference, it was sort of every man for himself, if you will. Stalin was like, no, this is my chance to take advantage of inexperienced Clement Attlee and inexperienced Harry S. Truman. Whereas Harry S. Truman was coming in saying, no, this is my chance to show that I am definitely anti-communist, that I am definitely pro-capitalist. This is my chance to show that I'm not just an accountant, I'm not just an administrator, I can be tough. So he saw this as an opportunity to sort of create this image for himself. So it almost became this direct competition between the two parties, with Stalin trying to show, I'm the experienced one, I'm the tough one, I know what's going on, I'm in control here. And Harry Truman, and to a lesser extent Clement Attlee, saying, no, you are not Stalin. We will show you by going so far the other way. So instead of meeting in the middle, they both basically retreat to their own sides. So after Potsdam, Stalin becomes even more determined to expand communism, and the USA and Britain become even more determined to combat that expansion. As a matter of fact, the Cold War technically begins with something called the Truman Doctrine. Harry S. Truman, who avowed that he would stop the spread of communism no matter what, which Stalin saw as a direct challenge. So this is what happened at the Yalta and Potsdam Conference. We see the origins of the Cold War, which would come to dominate politics for the next 50 years, worldwide politics. And we also see how it could have gone a little bit differently. So with all of that said, I hope we're a little bit clearer on the importance of the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, the origins of the Cold War, and of course, we remember how it could have been. With that said, thank you very much. See you in the next one.